There's them as think smuggling's all about chubby-cheeked West Country lads splashing ashore on lonely beaches with an anchor or two of brandy under their arm and carrying more assorted weaponry than that Jean-Claude Van Damme. Well, you has to, don't you, in case you has a run-in with the revenue men. Well, that's the Hollywood fantasy. I'm happy to say that the historical reality is very similar. So pay attention.
Over the years, Talon Bay saw more than its fair share of free traders hauling contraband up the beach. But then it's hardly surprising. It was somewhat conveniently situated for that nest of smugglers who liked to pose as hard-working, honest, upright fisherfolk. The people of Polperro.
90% of the people was involved in it. They were all involved in it, all the families. Well, there wasn't a family in the village that didn't have some part or other in it. Whether they were out to sea or the shore party, they all had some connection with it. It was just another way of living, like, you know, to them they could see not a lot of wrong in it. They weren't known as smugglers, it was more free traders than smuggling. The village was very fortunate. They had a gentleman came here called Sebaniah Job. He came from St Agnes. And he organised the smuggling. He was the man who organised the French connection, the French end of it, over to Guernsey. And Rostov was the two main ports they run from. He paid the bills, looked after the smugglers when they got into trouble, paid their debts and that. But it was through him that this became quite a successful business here in the village, all through Sebaniah Job. Of course, there was only two ways in this village, two roads in other than the sea. And the vessels used to come in around the quay and land on the quay. Everybody would turn to unload the vessels. It was all stored in the cellars. Every house had a cellar here. Everybody took their parts, stored it away. Of course, the nearest customs house was at Foy or Plymouth they had to come from. Well, once they found out they was on their way up, they'd sealed off the two roads. They couldn't get in the village to search them. When they cleared the vessels off and everything was gone, well, they'd open it up again and say, you have what you find. What you find, you keep. But they didn't used to find very much, I'm afraid.
And one of the reasons they didn't find very much in Polperro itself was that one of the smugglers' favourite hiding places lay outside the village, at the top of the hill behind Talland. Many's a night, horses and mules and men would toil up and down the steep, narrow lane, stacking and stowing their gear in the ecclesiastical safety of Talland Church.
Look, it may just have escaped your notice, but this part of the world around Polperro, it's positively awash with ghost stories. According to the locals, there's all manner of midnight manifestations waiting to leap out from behind gravestones or jump down out of the hedges onto anybody foolish enough to be out enjoying an innocent moonlit jaunt. Well, call me a cynical old sausage, but I get the distinct whiff of something terribly fishy about all this, and it ain't coming from the pilchard palaces down on the quay. Now look, I've no wish to be hard on anybody, but surely I'm not the only one who works out that this is all slightly dodgy. I mean, think about it. At some point in the past, there must have been a particularly bright member of the local smuggling community who thought to himself, I've got an idea. Let's put a few stories about in the bars and the restaurants and the takeaways that there are lots of ghosts in the area. And that way, everyone will stay tucked up safely in beddy buys, while the likes of me goes about my nefarious purposes with me mates. It's just a thought. You see, by and large, it worked. Not because people were frightened, far from it. Though it was a language, it was a code that everybody around here spoke. Everybody, from the parson here at Talland to the Blue Peter cider heads in Polperro, they all knew that when somebody said they'd seen a ghost up at the churchyard, what that actually meant was There was a rising tide tomorrow night, so stay well out of the way because we'll be running the stuff in. But of course, that was only natural. Everybody was involved in the trade at some level or other. The problems started to come when the government decided that they'd start using people from up country, outsiders, to police the smuggling. They began to bring in men whose names became cursed the entire length of this coastline.
The Polperro smugglers ran the gauntlet of the revenue cutters in the Channel every time they made the trip to Guernsey and back. But the revenue authorities did everything in their power to stop it. You know, they attempted raids on Polperro over land, they came in by sea, but it was almost impossible to catch the smugglers red-handed with the goods. And this went on for many, many years, well into the 1790s. But one man became to be feared more than anyone else by the smugglers. Gabriel Bray, Lieutenant Gabriel Bray. He was the commander of the revenue cutter Hind, and this ship eventually played a greater part in suppressing the smuggling trade in Polperro than any other. One of the raids that Gabriel Bray led resulted in a violent affray outside the cellar of one of the cottages here of the fishermen, where it was known that smuggled goods were hidden. But in the melee that followed, the smugglers burst in, seized the goods under the very noses of the revenue men, carried it off, and Gabriel Bray was powerless to prevent this happening. But the ringleaders were arrested subsequently. Two of them were ancestral cousins of mine, Richard and Benjamin Rowett, and another two Polperro men were eventually charged with affray and assault on revenue officers and tried. Gabriel Bray bought a house in Foy, just a few miles from here, and immediately made it known that his intention was to suppress the trade in the area.
In the late 1700s, if you wanted to get rich quick, you could go smuggling or buy a ticket in the English state lottery. Oh no, it's not a new idea. Zephaniah Job regularly played the numbers, but with tickets at 16 quid a throw, some of his colleagues opted for the run across to Guernsey. With typically black Cornish humour, they called their ship the Lottery. But it was never a lucky ship. They made the fatal error of shooting one of Bray's men.
Gabriel Bray was one of your exquisitely elegant, educated 18th century gentlemen. He also had the aggressive tenacity of a pit bull terrier. He was the one who was renowned throughout Kent as being the man who, with a single slash of his backsword, had all but severed the head of a smuggler he was fighting. And he made it widely known along the whole of the Devon coast that he fully intended to settle the account with the crew of the Lottery. And his chance came when one day he sighted her off Start Point. He put on all sail and began to give chase. And the moment the crew of the Lottery realised it was the Hind that was coming after them, they knew that Gabriel Bray was coming too. They tried every trick in the book to shake him off. They tacked here, tacked there, made all the way down the coast in a chase that lasted all day, through the night and on into the next day. But where Gabriel Bray had gripped, he wasn't going to let go. Finally overhauled them when they were becalmed off Land's End. For the crew of the Lottery, their number was well and truly up.
Roger Toms ratted out the rest of his crewmates. One, Tom Potter, an Irish lad living in Polperro, was singled out for death, and the rest were sentenced to hard labour.
Iconographic funerary monuments, that's decorated gravestones to me and thee, well, they can sometimes be the most wonderful time machines. Look at the ornate lettering on this grave slab. Behind that lies an even more elaborate story from the past, because this is the gravestone of Robert Mark. And he had been one of the crewmen on the Lottery. For his sins, he'd been sentenced to hard labour
in the prison hulks on the River Thames, but he'd somehow managed to escape from there because he turns up back here in Cornwall, plying his old trade. But this time, with disastrous results. He goes out on his last voyage in a ship called the Vulture, and in an almost exact rerun of the lottery incident, a revenue cutter comes down on them, tries to intercept and seize the vessel. Well, not surprisingly, the smugglers are not about to heave to for the revenue, but this time, it's the revenue men who've come prepared. This time, they're the ones who open up a fierce, brisk fire on the lugger. It drops 3 of the smugglers, 2 of them badly wounded, and 1 of them very dead. Where Robert Mark was concerned, the revenue took the view that that was an old score long overdue, finally settled. And as they beat back into the Falmouth estuary, they must have known that the wind was finally turning in their favour, and they were beginning to get the upper hand. Through the early decades of the 19th century, the revenue steadily pushed the smugglers onto the defensive. The days when the free traders could operate in broad daylight and carry things with a high hand were gone forever. Now, the gentlemen had to learn to play the game differently. Subterfuge and secrecy became their stock and trade. The smugglers had been driven underground.
Needless to say, the government were not exactly best pleased at the fact that huge amounts of its potential revenue kept disappearing into this vast black hole of smuggling. But of course, ordinary people, you and me, we had a slightly different point of view. As far as we were concerned, if the government was determined to slap an import duty on just about everything in the entire world, well, who'd be surprised that we turn a blind eye to the activities of the free traders? But take it a bit further than that. Just imagine, just for a minute, that you are a quarryman here in Beer. Every day, 6 days a week, you come to this place, and for 12 hours a day, in the most atrocious conditions of crippling damp and appalling danger, you work your tripes out for a pittance poor wage that barely keeps you and your family above the breadline. Is it any wonder that some of the bolder spirits would turn to smuggling as a way of escaping this abysmal existence?
I suppose one of the most embarrassing things about living in Beer Village, although it's a lovely place, is having so many people proud to say their ancestors were smugglers years ago, and them all knowing to this day that one of my ancestors at the same time was actually the local customs officer. And that was William Scott, but he came to rather a sticky end. Back in 1787, he was caught by some smugglers from Sidmouth upon Honiton Common, and him and another customs officer were actually murdered by the smugglers. And a murder so horrific that Parliament issued a reward for their capture of £200, which obviously was a considerable sum back in those days. So that to me now is quite an embarrassment, living in a smuggling village and having an ancestor who was a customs man. Of course, the quarries itself were widely used by the smugglers. Most of the quarrymen were involved in smuggling simply because of their poor wages and high taxes at the time. They were desperate to feed their families. I always remember when I was a lad coming down here to explore with some of my friends, and we found various things over the years, things like remains of old French brandy barrels. One day, we actually picked up what turned out to be the remains of an old French soap box, and an expert told us at the time that there was such a tax just on good soap back then for the ladies that men would risk their lives smuggling that by night and sell it just to get the money to feed their families. The quarryman would have known every square inch of over 70 acres of space cut out by hand. And the customs men would never come down here searching with an oil lamp because for various reasons, either getting lost or the quarryman not letting them out again, they'd never have seen the daylight again. So there's no way a customs man back then would ever have searched for contraband within the quarry.
One beer boy who'd have made the most of that particular dereliction of duty and happily hidden all sorts of gear in the quarry was an irrepressible and inveterate smuggler who made a bit of a name for himself along this coast. a persistent, unrepentant offender, and a probation officer's worst nightmare.
Jack Rattenbury was known in his day as the Rob Roy of the West. His escapades and adventures as a smuggler made him one of the most popular characters along the whole of this coast. Popular, that is, with everyone except the King's revenue men. But then Jack wasn't the sort of guy that would give a monkeys about what they thought. Jack probably started out like so many of them did, just another willing pair of hands, crewing a handy little boat like this. They'd take her out to the big smuggling luggers where they'd heave to off the shore. And then Jack and his mates would spend the rest of the night pottering backwards and forwards, offloading the contraband onto the beach and taking it inshore. But in 1806, Jack took that first vital step into the entrepreneurial world of the free traders. He actually bought himself a half share, in a smuggling galley. From then on, Jack was bound for glory. He wasn't the hired help anymore. No, Jack was the governor.
I think Rattenbury became a smuggler out of perhaps necessity because it was the best paid occupation that he could find for his skills as a mariner. But I think he also enjoyed it. I think he enjoyed pitting his skills against the revenue men here in Beer and at Sidmouth along the beach. He was resourceful. He liked to hide lace in tins. And I think he liked to be part of the group. He had a group of loyal people. He was loyal to his family, and he was loyal to his friends when they were in prison. They would have allies in the farmers. Sometimes it was the innkeepers, perhaps, who would help them. But they would always have allies here on land who would light fires up on Beer Head or in some of the fields behind Beer to warn the smuggling ships at sea if the revenue were about. Because the revenue men would stand in places like this and look out over Beer Head, looking for smuggling vessels, looking for fishing boats that would creep the tubs in. And if the revenue men caught those boats, caught those tubs, the tubs would be confiscated, the boats would be confiscated, and people like Rattenbury would lose not just their cargoes and the prizes, but perhaps the chance to continue making their livelihood.
Good smugglers had to be good seamen. Went without saying that Jack knew these waters like the back of his hand. That's why he was so good at getting this stuff across the beaches. But if a lad was going to make his mark in the retail distributive trade of the 19th century, well, he needed something a little more than good seamanship. He needed ice-cold cunning and barefaced cheek. Qualities which Jack had by the gallon. Now, contrary to what they'll tell you in this part of Devon, this isn't for getting babies out of the bath. This is a creeping iron, the smuggler's friend. Because what Jack and his mates would do, they'd drop the barrels out into the sea on specially weighted ropes. And then later, when there were no customs or revenue men about, they'd go out and drag the seabed for them, creep the bed to bring in the brandy. The joy of it was that they could dump it off the coast, sail into harbour without a care in the world on a completely clean boat, and then as soon as the coast was clear, out they went to bring home the contraband.
It was hidden up until it could be taken up country, and that's why somewhere like Bovey House was a godsend. Ruined and derelict in those days, it was haunted by ghosts, and we all know what that meant, including its owner, Lord Rolle, who no doubt had as refined a taste for French brandy and Dutch Genevas as his wife had for Mechlin lace and China tea, all of which items could be supplied at competitive rates by Messrs Rattenbury & Co., importers of fine wines and fancy goods, and smugglers to the aristocracy.
Out at sea, the smugglers were constantly playing cat and mouse with the revenue men. They were determined to get their gear safely ashore. But that's when the problems really began. Because unless they could store their gear with absolute safety so that it would defy the efforts of the most inquisitive revenue man who'd come looking for it, then there was every possibility that all their hard-earned cash was going to end up in King George's coffers rather than their waistcoat pockets. Men and women in this part of the world constantly exercise their minds to find the best way to hide the contraband. Deception and concealment were still the two most powerful weapons that the smugglers had. This whole coast was riddled with smugglers' caves, smugglers' tunnels, smugglers' hidey holes. In fact, they even say there was a tunnel that connected this place to the caverns at Beer. Well, whether you believe that or not, it doesn't matter. What I can tell you with absolute certainty is that down here, 130 feet down the shaft of this well, is a small room concealed in the wall. A room that was designed for no other purpose than to conceal contraband. And if you think the fat man in the funny suit is going to take you down there to look at it, think again. It's a sad fact that in the fullness of time, it was the smugglers themselves who needed the hiding places. The revenue were determined to destroy the trade once and for all. Life got more and more hard for men like Jack Rattenbury, and even old friends in high places found it more and more difficult to protect them. So poor old Jack did his time, but he did make one last trip into the deeply dangerous waters of the world of publishing. A little book called The Memoirs of a Smuggler. Like most of his voyages, he managed to turn a little profit out of it. He ended his days here, looking down on the very beach that he'd first gone out across all those years ago to become a smuggler in the first place. And he had his memories. Oh, and a little pension too, from Lord Rolle. Now, isn't that interesting?